Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nick Brancazio and Dr. Russell Meyer. Russell is a distinguished postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Nick is a scholar affiliated with the Department of Philosophy at University of Adelaide. And she also works with an educational nonprofit. I invited them to talk about a recent article they wrote together, published in the journal Constructivist Foundations. The title of the article is Enactivism, Utopian and Scientific. It's a Target article that is followed by several commentaries by other scholars, and then they respond to those commentaries. So thank you for, first of all, accepting my invitation. And I wanted to first ask what inspired you to write this article.
Yeah, well, thank you for having us. This is a really great opportunity. So inspiration, I think, came from a few different angles. I think I sort of might have both kind of academic and personal on some level. I sort of dragged Nick into this project. But I would say from the beginning, the inspiration was both me and Nick sort of got raised within this enactivist tradition. And I think maybe we'll say a little bit about what enactivism is, just to sort of situate the discussion here. So enactivism is sort of intended to be this alternative kind of framework, theoretical framework for psychology, for the cognitive sciences in general. And it kind of has its origins in the theories of like biological cognition, autopoiesis, coming from Maturana and Varela, so way back right in the late 70s, and sort of developed into, I guess, maybe we can go into this more later, but kind of a philosophical project of rebuilding and reworking like a philosophy of nature for the cognitive sciences, often very much kind of in conflict with mainstream cognitive science. So kind of rejecting computationalism, representationalism, these kinds of traditional views of what the mind is and how it works. I think that's about that's sort of the potted history of enactivism.
Yeah. I mean, the more positive, the spin is that there's the rejection kind of especially what was happening in the 80s in, computational, cognitive sciences, but then enaction was coming, or, the enactive ideas were coming more from, or at least drawing from, both biology and the phenomenological traditions and pragmatist traditions to some extent. So there's ideas that you weren't seeing implemented in the cognitive sciences at the time, like the study of first-person experience, or the integration of first-person experience into the sciences. The idea in thinking about perception that, organisms establish their own cognitive domain and thus, enact the world, and in their perception of it. And so it wasn't just the rejection, it was also this kind of proposal of, cognition being sensory motor schemes, or sensory motor coordination, and, cognitive habits and how those arose through, repeated sensory motor, activities and whatnot. So yeah, that's the tradition that we kind of came out of.
It's kind of one of these, bringing together one of several traditions, bringing together a lot of these kind of recentering, like embodiment, first personal experience.
But then kind of being raised in this tradition, it sounds cool.
Right.
And, after a little while of working in it, both Russ and I think kind of got to a stage where we were like, what are we doing here? What is kind of the aim, of enactivism as an approach or as a framework or, as a collection of theories? What is it that we're actually trying to accomplish?
Yeah, like on a personal level, I think Nick comes in from like really heavy like philosophical training. I started out in psychology and sort of transitioned over to philosophy because I was really dissatisfied with like representationalistic, like really standard kind of the sorts of explanations of phenomena you get in mainstream cognitive science. And lo and behold, like I came across this enactivism stuff. I'm like, wow, this is really, drawing on some really interesting stuff. And so I wanted to, well, I think we share this. We both were really inspired by the idea of these new kind of ways of explaining things, kind of breakthroughs, moving past kind of the traditional ways of doing cognitive science. And then, yeah, we started to see, okay, what is this project? Like, are we just telling a philosophical story? Are we hooking onto anything empirical? Are we getting new answers and explanations? And so answering those questions was the inspiration for this project. And kind of the previous paper that we wrote, Putting Down the Revolt, which was kind of arguing, that's where we developed this idea of the enactivism as a philosophy of nature, as kind of a internal philosophical project, more so than a scientific one.
Yeah, so that was drawing on Sean Gallagher's proposal that enactivism is really doing this, philosophy of nature stuff. And so we wrote this previous paper where we really dug into what is a philosophy of nature, what's it doing, and comparing that to something like proposing an alternative paradigm for the cognitive sciences. And you can do both at the same time, sure. But we were saying enactivism really is not proposing this alternative paradigm, or we're not on the verge of a shift, some kind of revolution in the sciences, just based on the building of this philosophy of nature. And so you can see how that kind of led into then this paper. And on the other hand, just with the kind of personal stuff, we wanted to, having kind of arrived at this, what are we up to? What does enactivism seem to be doing? What are the goals? What are our goals? What are we doing? And then, we wanted to kind of throw it to the community and, in the philosopher's way, writing an argumentative paper, but, to kind of invite, a community level self-reflection on what do we want to do, how, what are the goals, kind of incorporating an activist work, or doing all of this in activist work. What are we aiming at? Who's our real audience, and what kind of strategies should we be pursuing?
Usually when we get into the discourse of enactivism or an active cognitive science, the first stage is to identify what is the other side. The other side, the representationalist or cognitivist account. And many people might just stay in that phase of arguing with that other side, or their representation of that side, so to speak. And then the discourse might be about, are we being radical enough in responding and correcting that other side? But what I found really exciting in your work was going beyond that initial opposition between cognitivism versus enactivism. You're introducing really important distinctions. And the main distinction in the title is this utopian approach versus the scientific approach. So broadly speaking, why is this distinction important? And if you could describe it in broad strokes.
Yeah, sure. So the title kind of gives away what we're doing to some extent. So I was drawing from this, this socialist pamphlet. I just kind of thought that was a fun, but also apt comparison, right, between the kind of real gritty, let's doing the implementational work. That would be sort of the scientific side, versus the utopian side, which is kind of more building a far-reaching story about how your theory works. Those two broad kind of camps and sort of stamping them onto the enactivist story actually was quite illuminating, I think, about these two different trajectories in research. Davood, you were just talking about kind of this almost impulse to first begin with kind of the philosophical critique of the opponent, and kind of to set up them as the alternative mode of doing cognitive science. And I think that's where that's where I think the utopian story first becomes visible, because you can see, okay, there's one project that's about, or has as one of its aims, this critique, this thoroughgoing critique of the philosophical aspects of, traditional cognitive science. And the task there, as we sort of uncover, is more about building, the utopian story is about building this ideal complete, argumentatively like robust, defensible philosophical position that articulates kind of a sort of an ideal, I guess, of how, enactivism would change the world, what an enactivist revolution kind of would look like were it to occur. And then we noticed, okay, that seems to be a lot of the work. And that also doesn't really seem to necessarily translate right away. We don't even really have a timeline of how that turns into changes in practice. Mm. And that was the big, I think, speaking back to, or touching back on inspiration, that was kind of the big discovery, I guess, that lifted the paper into something we actually wanted to write was, oh, we've really excavated this tradition as one trajectory. And then the second trajectory being the scientific enactivism, which, and just for clarity, it's not, better or worse. It's not, scientific good, utopian bad. The scientific approach is more about, right, what are the kind of implementational opportunities for these enactive ideas? Where could we actually put them into practice and sort of test them out and see whether they work in the way that you would expect the sciences to sort of operate? You want to test hypotheses rather than just kind of theory build indefinitely. So that's this scientific project with quite different goals to the utopian project, since for the scientific enactivist approach, it's not really that important to necessarily be as theoretically like complete, far-reaching, defensible. You might just use little bits of enactivism, some of the useful ideas, while leaving some of the other ones behind when they're not particularly useful. So a much more pragmatic, philosophically kind of, ecumenical way of doing things. So I think that would be, those are the two sort of approaches that we've identified.
I think the distinction is, why this was important, I think, for us to kind of, propose this idea was, as we said, part of this kind of self-reflection, what are we doing? There's a lot of inter-enactive conflict, a lot of, the critiques are not just aimed at cognitivism, but there's a lot of conflict between, different ideas in enactivism or different kind of strands of enactivism, but also there's a lot of kind of finger wagging for incorporating the wrong kinds of terminology or the wrong kinds of language. And, we thought, well, that is, which needle is that moving? That kind of work. It's really aimed more at doing the theoretical work than the scientific work, which will have to, out of necessity, use the language of the science in which it's, in which it's trying to make implementations. So yeah, we thought, well, it's important for us to think about, us as a community to think about, when is it okay to, kind of do these projects where we're not trying to be the best enactivists, or as purely inactive, but, trying to, integrate enactivism into or certain ideas in cognitive science, that may go against kind of, the broader enactivist picture.
Yeah, I think moving the needle is the best description you've given of what we're doing here, or what we're identifying is, I think a lot of gut reactions, why this is important, I guess, is there's a lot of gut reactions from people in enactivism, because there's 30 years of tradition of this kind of combative, both internally and externally, trying to sort of do the enactivism Olympics, who's the best enactivism, who's the purest, or who's got the, the most accurate formulation, right, of a given concept. And I think, you have debates over well, you use the word knowledge, right? And that carries with it all these connotations of content and so on. And it's all right, that's fine. People can sort of debate about that, but what needle is that moving?
Right.
Another 30 years from now, if we have fully polished and refined, right, a word like knowledge until it's sort of enactive friendly, what have we done in terms of
changing cognitive science?
Yeah. I would say probably nothing or very little. or at best, it's unclear how that ultimately has some sort of effect, versus the needle moving of really just testing out, you know, making models of things like autopoiesis, making models of
Precarity,
right.
Mhm. Yeah, I really like that you went with the title that you chose, the utopian versus scientific, as opposed to empirical and theoretical, because I spend a lot of time. My own background is in psychology and cognitive psychology, and the moment you say theoretical versus empirical, people will say, well, if you have a theory, just you should have translate it into a hypothesis and then we test it. So these two are not really separate activities.
Yes.
But by using your terminology, you really highlight the different attention on each side. Each side has a different scope, different set of aims, and they are distinct from each other. They are almost like distinct spaces, spaces of activities. And with a better understanding of these two distinct spaces, we can get a better sense of what it means to do them well, to do each side well, and what it means for one side, the utopian side, the theoretical side, to kind of undermine its own aims. And maybe some of its implicit aims are not fulfilled in action because they unknowingly move to the other side. So shall we move to a little bit of a discussion on the utopian side, what it means to occupy that space, that side of the space?
So the idea for, I mean, I think, you know, the title sort of came first in a way. I think on a gut level, I had identified, all right, I feel like there's these two different things going on. And maybe that's not the most like rigorous start to a paper or something, but I thought, oh, that's kind of a fun title, and it's, you know, it's got something going for it. And then, you know, but the more and more we went through, the more it's kind of remained accurate. And I wanted to sort of cast, you know, the role of utopian and activism. And fortunately, we had just written this paper on enactivism as a philosophy of nature. And I think this paper, Utopian and Scientific, really takes this idea and runs with it. The idea being that, and this comes from, Sean Gallagher discussed the idea very briefly in his 2017 book and on enactivism as a philosophy of nature. And the idea being, you know, that not everything has to be about immediate implementation. Some things can be about, some work can be about building a kind of holistic, integrative story across different scientific disciplines, across philosophical accounts, that builds something more like a coherent or cohesive ontology. What are sort of the bits and pieces that are going to figure in our discussions of and our descriptions and explanations of the phenomena we find in the world? So coming up with an alternative kind of enactive story to contrast maybe with the kind of mechanistic, like computational story that has much more kind of currency in the sciences and just in society in general, is in itself sort of a worthy project, is the idea.
I agree with all that. I mean, part of what we wanted to do in the first paper was to stress the importance of building a philosophy of nature also. That, you know, a philosophy of nature is where you know, and going back to your question as well, like what's going on in that space, it's where you see, you know, the stuff that, you know, happens before science, right? You have to, you know, you have theory and then science follows a lot of the time. And so you see conceptual applications, you see kind of integrative work, you know, interdisciplinary work, kind of how does this, you know, the theorizing over here and the theorizing here, how do these match up into, you know, something within the enactivist worldview? And, you know, still based in, you know, the idea of autonomous agency, for example, or, you know, like the, you know, the organizational kind of principles that enactivism works with. So there's a lot of that kind of work, integrative work, you know, kind of theory building and then theory stretching, I'd say, you know, scaling up from, you know, just these kinds of biological principles to these other, you know, psychological principles, and then, you know, going into, okay, how is there work that we can do in thinking about social structures? Is there work that we can do in thinking about, you know, marginalization? Is there work that we can do thinking about, you know, and integrating with, you know, theories in other fields? So, you know, kind of the utopian picture is, you know, doing all of that kind of work, which is important work. And I mean, we both, I think, contributed to, you know, that with our own projects, you know, as well. There's this conflict though, and, you know, with utopianism or utopian, it's not an ism, right? Utopian enactive projects and how they can sometimes, you know, stand in the way of their own advancement in the cognitive sciences, how they stand in the way of their own kind of integration. And I think one of the, you know, one of the commentaries, Guy's commentary, Sanchez de Oliveira, was really fantastic in talking about kind of how the distinction that we, you know, the utopian and scientific distinction, you can think about how it works internally and externally, and you know why it could be maybe rejected internally, but would be good externally. But I think that's also really good for thinking about, and Russ brought this up, or had mentioned this to me the other day, you know, how the advancement of utopian enactivism, how all of this theory building, you know, and kind of deciding how things should be done, you know, ahead of time, you know, works really well for the internal advancement of the project, because it's like, oh yeah, we've got a theory for this, we've got a way of explaining this and this and this and this, and all of it kind of happening way before the sciences, you know, have really kind of, or there's been kind of this, you know, external scientific integration showing that even kind of the basics work. We don't really have that.
Yeah.
So, you know, internally, the advancement, you know, there's just all this, there's just a huge proliferation of enactive theories of this and that all the time. But externally, there's not really much happening insofar as like practical, you know, implemented scientific studies that can support the weight of all of this theory, really.
Right. So for somebody, like maybe a student who comes to you and says, you know, I'm really interested in this, in activism as a philosophy of nature, would you caution them against doing certain type of thing, like giving advice to scientists, or maybe would you tell them to read a lot of science, not just things that they should do, but also things that maybe they should give up by choosing this side of the project?
Yeah.
I'd like to start on that. So
That's some things to say.
yeah. I think on that, like, I think if somebody is interested in, you know, like you said, a student is really interested in enactivism, it's really important to kind of get familiar with the basics, what enactivism is really doing. And yeah, by reading a lot of kind of the core theory, and by also reading not just characterizations from enactivists about what science is doing, but go and read the science and see if, you know, a student actually agrees with the characterizations coming from enactivism. Because I think a lot of those characterizations are really outdated. So, you know, if you go back and you read canonical enactivism from the 90s, well, that's not what science looks like anymore. You know, even if you're reading enactivist works from the, you know, 2000s, right? You know, early 2000s, that's not what the cognitive sciences look like right now. So I think that it's really important not to just kind of trust those characterizations, because you have to be engaged with the sciences to accurately characterize what's happening in the sciences. So that's one thing that I would really encourage students looking to get into enactivism to do, is really understand what's going on in the science, because science is a lot more amenable to enactive type ideas, you know, and, you know, theories of embodiment and stuff than it was even 10 years ago, especially 20 and 30 years ago. So, you know, there's not, you know, it's not this computationalism, you know, all the way throughout anymore.
Right.
Another thing that I would really encourage people who want to do, you know, utopian projects of integration to do is make sure that they're doing a lot of reading in the work that they want to integrate with. I think it's wonderful that enactivists really want to build bridges with other kinds of theorizing. And myself, you know, I work in, you know, also in feminist theory, and I see a lot of stuff wanting to integrate with, you know, traditionally marginalized theories that don't do enough reading of those theories. There's some fabulous work that does, but, you know, I think amplifying pre-existing, you know, marginalized voices is really important. And it's a more important project to bring those ideas into enactivism than to try and bring enactivism over to those theories and go, look at this, you know, like
reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff,
Exactly. So, you know, there's, amplifying and listening are really important, I think, for utopian and activist interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I guess, on a different sort of trajectory, like some of the problems that we point to in the paper. I mean, we had a lot to say about this. I think there's a few thousand words I've got sitting somewhere of like various grievances that weren't really constructive to the paper. You've got to pick your battles, I guess. But I would say things like, yeah, this sort of shadow boxing with cognitivism is mostly just that, shadow boxing. There's not really a real opponent there. There's no actual resistance. It's just sort of a demonstration of theoretical strength that doesn't really, I mean, it's really an internally aimed process, right? You do this stuff as sort of the precursor to any enactive paper or book. You know, you kind of find a target, mostly not perhaps as charitably constructed as could be, right? There's a lot of battling with like Jerry Fodor,
Still,
right, in absentia, right? It's like setting him up as a target,
right.
and I think that's really not super helpful. You know, I don't think that's moving the needle on the Utopian project, and I think just through sheer almost fatigue, like we've read so much of this stuff, with time you start to just see it detach from sort of the worldly concerns of even philosophy, as worldly as that is. And I would say the other thing would be, I would warn a student, I would say, you know, it's fine to do that kind of work, and there's certain, you know, career pressures on people, publication and so on. But I would say for enactivism as a long-term project, utopian enactivism as a long-term project, there's a real risk of becoming more like an echo chamber, of debating against a target that doesn't really, or an opponent that doesn't really exist, and just kind of doing a lot of fairly speculative work that never really comes down to earth, never really kind of, you know, hooks into the rock face as we're trying to climb up and learn more things. It's just kind of dangling there. So I would say try to, read up on your science a little bit, or at least see what's going on there and see what people are amenable to, rather than assuming it's in this kind of all or nothing battle, right? You've got to accept the entire backlog of enactive theory, right? Or you're wrong. I think that's, especially for early career researchers, like trying to stake out a claim, that's a real risk. So that would be my warning, I guess, to, well, not even warning, but, you know, it's a gentle suggestion to veer away from that.
That's great. That's great. Basically, it's almost like playing 20 question game, a 20 question game with the field. You know, we got at some point get past those early questions and get to more, as you know, it's a common word these days. The word nuance is thrown around a lot, but I think it applies well in this case. So on the other side, we have the scientific branch, the scientific approach, which you also describe as intervention, an activist intervention in a field, in a particular field. And I wanted to ask you how, in your view, that relates to cognitive sciences in general. You already hinted at the fact that they don't put up as much resistance in the empirical fields as maybe some philosophical and activists would like to claim. But in general, an activist intervention, is it like finding some effect, some phenomena that only an activist sensibility can explain or can even ask about? So more on that scientific side.
Yeah. So the term is a nod to Sean Gallagher again, whose 2017 book was called Enactivist Interventions. And we like the idea of intervention. Russ works on mechanism as well, and a lot of, works on explanation. And intervention is a word that comes up a lot.
Right.
But we thought it was apt for kind of explaining, what enactive, scientific enactivism is up to, because it's not, again, not doing these paradigm shifting kind of things. It's, kind of in a particular domain of science, it's going in and doing something, like these interventions, it's not going in and taking over the field. It's intervening in certain ways. So it's, we thought that was a good term, for kind of explaining, or, for thinking about what scientific enactivism is doing. And that's more appropriate than saying, it's a revolution. It's,
Yeah. So I think that's where the intervention term comes from. And I mean, we've been talking about this, and I mean, we discussed it in the paper as well, but, enactivism does have, scientific enactivism is still, in many ways quite small. It's not, as Nick just said, it's not this revolutionary sort of takeover that maybe, again, in the utopian sphere, that's kind of what's being built is a full alternative. In practice, much more targeted, much more small scale, and often, it's like fragments of an activism, or it's not the entire package. It's not every enactivist commitment. It's a couple of useful ideas. So, I think enactivism comes up really early on, say in the 90s, early 2000s, in, for instance, work by like Esther Talon and Linda Smith on like infant reaching, infant development in general, where they were bringing to bear like this dynamical systems approach that was really new. And, these were scientists who were just looking for what worked. They weren't, they ended up being quite wary of positing like computation and representation in their explanations, but that was because they found a really useful alternative at kind of the level they were working. And using like enactive principles of like embodiment and inaction, like the bringing forth of an infant's world through their early experiences, rather than kind of citing, like brain development as kind of the precursor to new behaviors. Like that was a really big step forward in understanding those phenomena.
But sorry, I'm just going to
go ahead.
I think that is a really good example of where an activist, type thought was used to describe something in a new way that wasn't possible on previously existing explanations, right? Like their work specifically. But there's not a lot of that. There's not a lot of, places where enactivism's interventions have been to provide an explanation of a phenomena that could not be given otherwise, where there was no explanation. A lot of it is reinterpretive work. So providing an enactivist explanation that some other kind of explanation, where another kind of explanation already exists. So, we might have an information theoretic explanation that is then put into DST explanatory terms, but they're just, and Randall Beer has just written a paper on this, they're just two ways of looking at something, and they're two types of explanations, and they're two different lenses, and they're both useful for different things. But there aren't a lot of examples of enactivism coming in and doing something that just was not possible previously.
Right. Right.
So, you know, as we talk about this a bit in the first paper, you know, on this kind of re-explanation of different phenomena through the enactive lens. And there are a lot of really good explanations if you're an enactivist, you know, of phenomena, especially in like social cognition, that are, you know, really kind of well-developed explanations of, you know, phenomena on social cognition that you can get using explanatory resources from enactivism. It's just that if you're not an enactivist, they wouldn't really do anything for you.
They're not even really explanations.
Yeah.
If your ontology is completely different, what counts as a good explanation is going to be completely different. And so, I mean, that was the previous paper, was kind of pushing back against this idea that you could establish who had the better explanation, because it's relative to what you think, what you've already walked in the door with theoretically.
Yes.
And, you know, that it's totally legitimate to be a non-enactivist and say, well, those aren't even explanations. And we've already got our own functional explanations. They already work. So yeah, not a lot of areas where enactivism kind of like cracked the case wide open and, you know, changed things, did something that traditional approaches couldn't do. But certainly areas where it can add something into the mix that wasn't there, that turns out to be productive.
Yeah. And also on this, I mean, so there's work by, you know, Marieke Rode, has done really a lot of experimental work on perception and sensory motor coupling. O'Regan has done a lot of work in this area. Hanna de Jager has, you know, worked with a lot collaborators and done quite a bit of, you know, empirical work in social cognition. There's neurophenomenology, which has like kind of this, I feel like it's like neurophenomenology has maybe stalled a little bit, but is that fair?
I feel like it depends on whether you thought it was doing, I mean, it's a controversial area, but it's trying to do something.
Yeah.
It is very challenging to do neurophenomenology. That's part of it is because how much work it takes to do compared to other more disciplinary, conventional kinds of research. Anyways, I interrupted you.
Yeah. No. But you know, that's part of the thing is, you know, neurophenomenology, a lot of practicing, you know, people who work in, you know, research psychology go, okay, well, this is just doing an alternative version of something that we're already doing, because it's not as if psychology, you know, we write this in the paper, like isn't already integrating first person and third person perspectives in research. So this is another thing where it's, you know, the finger wagging, you know, of 20 or 30 years ago, just really doesn't apply to how psychology is working today. There's a lot more openness to phenomenological methods than there was 20 years ago. And it's just not clear really what enactivism offers. If you can do that, you know, with just psychology as is, why do you need,
what's the pitch for enactivism?
Yeah. And then there's, you know, the enactive torch, which is a haptic device for perception. So that's something that, you know, an example of building a technology, you know, that's really useful and has been involved in a ton of experiments now, but really coming from enactive thought. And then there's in the computer sciences, just fabulous work going on, you know, in like proof of concept type stuff. You know, coming from Randall Beer, you know, testing all kinds of really, you know, fundamental and activist ideas about self-organization, about autonomous agency, you know, in model systems, you know, through kind of the, you know, evolution-based models. So there, you know, again, it's not, is it, you know, it's moving the needle, sure, but is it, you know, has it changed, revolutionized cognitive science? I mean, yeah, some of that work has, but not necessarily because of the enactivism. You know, it's not kind of, you know, leading towards a paradigm change.
Right. It wasn't the revelation of enactivism that made that work useful. It's that enactivism contributed to a broader, more, you know, a broader, interesting project. It was a useful tool in kind of a toolbox. Yeah.
Yeah. Matthew Egbert's work, I think, is just absolutely excellent. I wish Enactivists were all like paying really close attention to his work, because he's also doing all of this computation, like not computational, but modeling, testing out really these core ideas of enactivism as applied to non-biological systems, like metabolism-based agency and things like that, which really kind of should make us, if we're thinking of enactivism, the biological basis of enactivism, kind of, making that a little bit more fuzzy and unclear than I think people realize. So really, really interesting stuff happening there.
I think that's a really great point, that enactivism creates more contact points between disciplines. So it's easier to be interdisciplinary because intervention, I think, the common use of the more common use of the word intervention in everyday life, usually we use it when there's a friend in need of an intervention. They have a dependency on something, or they have a bad habit, and they're kind of, because of their dependence, there's an inconvenience in breaking that the habit or what they're doing, that form of life, that style of life. We're inconveniencing them, and that's why it is a real question: what is the pitch of enactivism? Because it is going to be more work for for many people, uncertain payoff. I wanted to ask you, because you're also in touch with both philosophy and cognitive science psychology, is there also a problem of unfamiliarity with philosophical insights? Do you think that cognitive scientists or psychologists have a little bit of an aversion to philosophy? Is there kind of guardedness? Because everybody's already busy. Why? And philosophy is and I say that as somebody who has sympathies with philosophy, but it's always been difficult to communicate that, the importance, significance of philosophical work. Please.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that, for all researchers, we're all busy, everyone's busy, and it's not clear what the payoff is of engaging with enactivist philosophy, philosophical works. So maybe there's a hesitance in some sense, because the processes are different in publishing, scientific works than they are for publishing philosophical works. And the integration of, even if somebody does really like enactivist philosophy, integrating it into research is very tricky. But also, just getting off the ground and getting people to engage with enactivist philosophy, it should be clear, I think, and this is also part of the inspiration of the paper, it should be clear to us, anyone kind of working in enactivism, what our elevator pitch is. What is it? What is the payoff? Why should someone who's, doing research in psychology, what should they read and why? And what are they going to get out of it? I would not know what to tell someone.
Yeah, I think part of the problem there is that the elevator pitch thus far focuses a lot on the kind of really broad overarching commitments of enactivism, like you got embodiment and you push those things forward. And there are some people in the sciences who that really gels with, and they're like, oh, that's really cool. Then you don't see a lot of transformation of that into practice necessarily, because they're cool ideas that someone might really like. And then the fine grain of how that's going to actually work is a whole other story. And I think part of the difficulty now, and from the past now into the future, is I think the elevator pitch is going to be different every single time, right? It's going to be like someone's got a specific problem, be it as far as biology to cognitive science, and they've got a particular problem, and you've got some philosophical contribution that might help out there. I think that's going to look different every single time, and it's going to require the philosopher in question, or the team in question, to really know their stuff and to be really identifying the gap. So I think that there maybe can't be an activist sort of elevator pitch that's that satisfactory. Though I would say, in my own experience through being educated in psychology to address, is there resistance to engaging with philosophy? I mean, I think definitely there is kind of a, particularly I would say within psychology, somewhat within neuroscience. I mean, they're kind of keen on like consciousness talk, but maybe less so on other kind of talk. But, within psychology, I think there's a fear that like shaking the foundations too much might be kind of detrimental to the whole field, right? Psychology still has this problem, like, are we a science? Are we not? Like, what is it we're doing? Right? People still have, I think there's a little bit of anxiety about like, okay, we don't want to agree to terms that are going to detonate the whole project.
Right.
Whereas I think, if you're a physicist or something, you may be like, yeah, let's get philosophical. Like, I'm not in doubt that physics is going to still be a thing at the end of the talk.
We're immune. Yeah, we're immune to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, right now, so I'm at specifically, very, very new. So we're just kind of putting down roots, but there's, Chinese Academy of Sciences founded my faculty, the Institute of Philosophy, to basically try and do philosophical work integrating with science. And, you've always got institutional pressures, and scientists are on these loops of designing an experiment, getting grant funding, doing the experiment, writing the paper, starting again, and leaping into that process and saying, hey, you want to do some, philosophy? There's sort of, from what I've, I'm getting into this kind of project now, but I've heard people from various sciences who want to work with people working in various sciences who say, at first they're often quite wary just because where does that fit into the story, right? Where is that contributing to getting a grant? Are you designing an experiment for me, right? Are you writing something up? And so there's work for philosophers to meet scientists where they are and explain to them, well, you can actually write papers without doing an experiment. You can get, grant funding these different ways. I think the way to success, not just for an activist, but for anyone trying to do that kind of work, is meeting people where they are and showing them the very specific benefits that you can give them, rather than, you hear horror stories of like scientists turning up to an interdisciplinary workshop or convention or something, or conference rather, and being kind of hounded by the philosophers about, the nitpicky kind of theoretical stuff. And that doesn't really serve anybody. So I think genuinely working to help scientists kind of see the light of these incremental advances philosophy can bring is something Enactivism is going to have to engage in going forward if it wants to make kind of progress.
And that's, just to be fair, that's a problem for philosophers in general. Yeah. It's not just an activist.
Yes, that's a problem of the field.
Yeah, and it's just something that we need to do, all of us as philosophers. Not to say that we're not good at being interdisciplinary, but interdisciplinary research is the future. It's what we need to be doing, and understanding how other research works, not just kind of the ideas that are removed, is really important.
Right. I really like that response. Which leads me. My next question was about the future of Enactivism. In your view, particular challenges ahead, opportunities. So, any general thoughts on that? Anything that frustrates or irritates you? Also, could be anything.
Well, the paper is born out of unarticulated grievances. So
yeah, well, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, kind of leads into opportunities, right? Opportunities, in pursuing interdisciplinary work, there's opportunities to listen more to, researchers, to, in other fields, and understand what their real challenges are, not just, bring in, pre-existing kind of, grievances, but to, meet, psychologists, neuroscientists, biologists, where they are and have, you know, a real discussion about what the challenges are in their research. You know, I think there are opportunities, other listening opportunities, as I said, in integrating, you know, with, or, you know, building bridges with work in traditionally marginalized areas, or working with, you know, new areas to listen and amplify the voices of, you know, and really kind of be more self-critical and self-reflective as researchers and go, okay, what have we left out in theory building? Where were we not fundamentally incorporating, you know, ideas from, you know, marginalized, you know, lived experience, considering how important lived experience is, you know, supposed to be to enactivists.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of marginalized lived experience is just missing.
Yeah.
So, you know, opportunities to listen more and to rethink kind of, you know, some of the core ideas, especially in, you know, psychological approaches to enactivism or enactive approaches to psychology. I think, you know, one of the big challenges, but also opportunities, is to build that elevator pitch, you know, really kind of have a community discussion about what it is that enactive ideas, and not enactivism, not the whole thing, you know, not like the whole system, but where specific ideas are useful and how.
Yeah.
You know, I think having, you know, more of a group discussion about that, you know, would be good. And it's a good opportunity, you know, because right now that's a challenge, but, you know.
I mean, I think you're totally right. Like, I've seen this in action just recently. I went to the Artificial Life Conference, A-Life in Japan. It was really interesting to see how, I think I was one of like 2 philosophers there, and we were both enactivists. So we were just kind of wandering around. I mean, the other was Tom Froese, who's also a scientist, who runs probably the world's most important, biggest enactivism oriented lab doing scientific work. Is there anyone doing anything? I think it's the biggest.
It's probably the biggest in academia.
In academia.
Marika wrote it, I mean, has like a center, but it's not academics.
Right, okay. And yeah, it was really sort of fascinating to see people there working in like synthetic biology, working in like computer science, AI, all these sorts of fields you would imagine that people would be engaged in discussing artificial life. And, you know, most of them, yeah, they knew what enactivism was. They'd heard of enactivism. They knew about like autopoiesis, is this interesting idea to do with like cellular cognition. The almost universal response I got, if I ever asked people about, was like, yeah, I don't really know what to do with it though.
Right.
Like they thought, oh, that seems correct. Seems right. I agree with it. But, you know, these are people with like, who are actually trying to do specific kinds of work. And so, yeah, these more specific pictures of where and how an idea like autopoiesis contributes to trying to build artificial cells, trying to develop, you know, synthetic tissues and the sorts of things that are going to build together into like a sort of framework for artificial life. Like this is what I think enactivists maybe need to do a bit more of.
No, I think
that's a possible future.
Even, you know, as an opportunity, you know, put into opportunity terms, like for philosophers writing papers on, you know, kind of proposing theoretical ideas. A lot of times, a lot of the time, what is missing at the end of that paper is an explanation of what changes, you know, if someone were to adopt this idea, or what changes if, you know, we, you know, shift from this theory of, you know, whatever to the enactive theory of, you know, whatever that's been proposed. So, you know, we can take it as an opportunity to, you know, be more explicit about what changes when, you know, some theoretical proposal gets implemented. So it's, you know, because there are ways to bridge utopian and scientific, you know, but we have to work at it. You know, and that's one thing is, you know, that can be what changes in an empirical sense. Okay, so what changes in, you know, how someone is going to approach these certain types of experiments? You know, not just reinterpretations, but actual.
Right. And to connect to what you were saying before, like marginalized approaches, I think often there's a risk of sort of, concluding a paper or the thrust of something of a bit of utopian work being, well, in this quite general way, enactivism seems more like accommodating of subjectivity and so on. And that is meant to kind of stand in for, right, there's no real story there about how it's actually bringing in and implementing or making use of these marginalized approaches. So people sort of say, oh, well, there's a real common view out there that enactivism, part of what it's going to do is integrate cognitive science and feminist approaches, for instance. But maybe this is not cashed out in, right, how exactly does that work? What's the takeaway? How does that happen?
Yeah.
So, and when I say enactivism should do X or Y, I mean, I don't mean to say I am the arbiter of what enactivists should do, but more in the sense of, if enactivism wants to achieve sort of the stated goal of doing unique work that generates progress in the sciences, that's kind of what's going to have to happen.
What you pointed out, I can maybe summarize it by just the difficulty of creating genuine dialogue, like how difficult it is, including, like, it is really shown during conferences, events like conferences. We can have a series of monologues, and at the end of each monologue, people can say, yeah, that's very interesting. And then moving on to their, it's their turn to talk. But to generate real dialogue is to generate the opportunity for both sides or multiple sides to change, to become open to each other. And that's, it's
a big ask in academia, where everyone has,
Yeah.
A vested interest in their own research agenda. But, so one of the questions we should ask, whether academia even facilitates that kind of open dialogue, or how do we change it so that it does,
I think it's a good step to grasp and understand that challenge in the first place. I think that's a good starting point. Yeah, I wanted to also ask about your collaboration. How do you work together? Do you have different styles of work, different kind of questions, and then you common grounds and against that background? Common grounds against the background.
Yeah.
So Russ had said the other day, because we were talking about this, because we collaborate frequently. So Russ, we wrote we have 3 papers together.
Yeah.
And our, we like to talk about about philosophy together. We like to talk about all kinds of things together. But Russ had said to me the other day, well, it seems like we have the same gut reactions to things very often, which makes it very easy. And I think that's right. But I also think that when we don't, we're very open to understanding the perspective of the other, we listen more than argue.
Yes.
I think. And so that makes working together pretty easy.
Yeah, we really don't argue a lot. I think usually there will be a point where I will say something that's like dramatically wrong, and then Nick will point out what like quite well reasoned sort of counterpoint to what I've just said is. And I think usually I'm just sort of like, oh, okay, well, I guess I was wrong. So I think and then I guess on the other hand, I probably talk a lot and make a case, and you're like, okay, fine, I guess I'll go along with that. So I think we have very different like I guess, like, for instance, I started this paper with a title, right? And kind of almost like I think I have more like a writer's intuition, like what's going to be the sort of fun, sexy, interesting. And I have to say, Davood, I'm kicking myself about the enactivist interventions thing, that I did not have that as like, an intervention for an activist. Like,
I know that.
I can't believe we did.
Good.
It's not too late. It's not too late.
Yeah.
It's yours now. It's yours now. I would feel remiss in stealing it, but
no, go for it.
I think I begin with sort of a gut feeling, right? For instance, about the state of enactivism and what's going on, and then kind of go from there, and then write a lot and cut it down so I can produce a lot of writing and then kind of winnow it down to stuff that's useful. I think Nick is part of our writing style so far has been Nick is really fantastic at taking, you know, a lengthy kind of screed and finding a way, like finding, first of all, contributing some angle that I hadn't thought of that reorients the paper and makes it make a lot more sense. And then kind of finding the thread of argument really rigorously. I think that's like a partnership that works well. Like we're both, I think, quite capable writers. I think we're both quite capable philosophers. But I think my strength is maybe generation, and Nick's strength is like structure. Yeah, that structure and that like refinement. Yeah. So we work quite well together in that sense. I think taking this kind of work seriously and trying to produce good work means you have to develop a certain level of humility, at least within this sphere of your life, in that if you think you're always right and you're not willing to, as Nick always says, murder your darlings, right? Kill the bits of the writing that you think are the cleverest and the most brilliant. If you're not willing to detach yourself from a kind of ego connection to that stuff, you're always going to be kind of impoverished, right? You're not going to be able to make use of other people's really valuable contributions. I think, at least in that way, our collaborations work well because we're able to not take it personally when we realize the other person is right, that something we've put in the paper doesn't make a lot of sense.
I think that's a really good point. That really, once we have an idea, it becomes about the idea, you know, like everything from there. Once the idea is there, like we are committed to the idea, and neither of us take things personally, like, you know, from that point on, because we're both just committed to readability, to, you know, how we want to express this, to, you know, really caring about our audience and making sure that, you know, we're saying things in a way that people will understand, and, you know, that we're, that the idea is going to make sense, and that the argument's going to make sense. And we don't really kind of bring our egos into it after the idea is there. We just kind of
sometimes I have to wrestle with it. Well, I think sometimes I'll have like some really grandiose kind of like conclusion to a paper, and Nick will be like, you don't need to say half of this. So still, but that's good. That's a good, I can sort of feel confident in producing the paper that if there is any extravagance, Nick is gonna go in there with a red pen and kind of kill it off. It also helps that we're friends, you know, on a personal level, right? We have known each other for years. We did our PhDs alongside one another here in Wollongong, so that always makes us excited to work together and to have the chance to talk about things. We just have to battle to keep ourselves on track with the writing of the paper sometimes, and not get distracted into talking about whatever we feel like. But I think that definitely helps and is part of our style together.
Cool, great. I think it's really important what you mentioned about a shared gut reaction, especially if that shared gut reaction is not widely shared, like looking around and seeing like why aren't there more people having this kind of reaction? And I think sharing that in common is worth, it's something that is worth fighting for. And it's worth like sacrificing a little bit of ego and accommodating a little bit. So I hope you continue to write many more papers together.
Thank you. Well, we're going to do our best. We have ideas to last us 10,000 years.
Nice. 10,000. Wow.
Yeah. Well, every time you write a paper, that generates ideas for
sure.
More.
Yeah.
Like bacteria. Keeps multiplying. But we'll hopefully actually some of those will become concrete as the years go by.
Did you want to add anything about the open peer commentaries? I'm curious about that process. I have written a few things in the form of open peer commentary for Constructivist Foundation, and I'm curious about your perspective on it, especially because of maybe a little bit. Your paper was a little bit controversial. I mean, some people might view it in that light. So I was curious about your experience with the OPCs.
Yeah, so we really had just a great experience with constructivist foundations all the way through. And the editor, Alexander Riegler, really, I mean, it was
Basically,
it is it's a contentious paper, a little controversial. And, that was kind of clear from the get-go that he was really supportive of getting it out there. And, we felt very understood. Then with the peer commentaries, we really wanted to prioritize, bringing in early career researchers or, mid-career researchers, over kind of going to, some of the bigger names in Enactivism. We did get, some well-known, bigger names, in there, but, really it was a conversation we wanted to have, with the community, not bounce off of some of the big names. So, we felt like Alexander really understood that and did a great job in selecting commentators. So yeah, because it was people who are maybe like us, working with Enactive Ideas kind of a couple years out of PhD or having just finished, and are kind of meeting with the world, outside of kind of the Enactivist bubble and might be, having issues or, might have some perspective on, where to go from here. What is it that we're doing? So it was really like I said at the very beginning, an invitation for kind of, community self-reflection and also, kind of a recognition that we're part of the future of Enactivism. It doesn't get decided by, a handful of people who've written the books. Sure, they got to write the definitions and stuff, but what we get to do with it from here on, we need to kind of have a conversation amongst ourselves, right? About what to do with these ideas and what the best way to integrate these ideas with other fields is and how to do those things. And, that needs to be, again, ongoing thinking together and collaboration and discussion, just not like something, from on high.
Right. I think there's a long tradition in Enactivism at this point of kind of, or at least I guess it's become kind of established that there's sort of ideas have to be submitted to this kind of grand council of Enactivism, right? And there's kind of the classic texts and their authors, and every big paper that claims to kind of shift the story has to sort of come from them or go through them, and which is a really strange kind of
very
arrangement.
Scholastic. It's a very scholastic.
That's a very good way of putting it. It's a very strange scholastic. I mean, we talked about virtuous pagans in the paper.
Yeah.
Kind of feeling, and I think in the commentary response we talked about heresy and kind of that there's this idea that and the way that Enactivism will work and will continue to work and what it will discover and what kind of answers it will provide was already prescribed in those texts, right? It's almost like and if you deviate from those texts, you're doing something wrong. And I think, you kind of already said this, Nick, the opportunity with the peer commentaries, which were fantastic, we're so happy with how they turned out, was to maybe short circuit or bypass that kind of approach a little bit and to instead, hear from people who we haven't really heard from. Once we've presented this option to people of rethinking the tasks of Enactivism, and these two things that are often mixed together, this utopian and scientific story, when we take them apart, what are people making of that option that we've provided? Mm-hmm. And I think what we sort of saw from the commentaries and what was so useful about them was, I think, some really useful pushback in some cases, ways that we could refine the idea, ways that we could develop this idea of utopianism more. And then I think the main contention was about, actually, I think kind of where we started this discussion, this dispute about theory and practice.
Yeah, and Davood, you had brought up, that you liked the utopian scientific and that, we hadn't said, theory, science, and tried to distinguish between those. Yeah. And we think, several of the commentaries did, kind of went the theory science distinction and, criticized that rather than kind of the utopian scientific projects. And, but, that then gave us an opportunity to respond in our response to those commentaries. No, like, we are not making a hard distinction between theory and science. And, that's not what this is about, because science is necessarily theoretical, and they're both human practices. It doesn't mean that you can't, have empirical rigor. And that can't be something that continues to be a kind of practice that's separate than utopian theorizing. And that's an important distinction. So, for thinking about the goals. So it was, that you can have those things and recognize that they're not separate, but yet still have the kind of distinction that we wanted to make between the aims of the projects. So I'm glad we had the chance to clarify that in the response of it, because it's important. And, I think that, trying to collapse the distinction between utopian and scientific actually hurts enactivism more than helps it. It doesn't, it's, again, kind of thinking about how to integrate this with science. We don't want to be saying, oh yeah, like theorizing and science are the same thing. That's, that really kind of hurts the project. I think, the overall kind of enactivist project, more than helps.
I would add, as a small thing, I think we wanted to be clear that, when we're talking about utopian and scientific enactivism, we're not talking about utopian and scientific like enactivists. It isn't. We really wanted to be careful not to try to paint particular like people as representing one or one or the other of these accounts, because I think one of these approaches, because I think just inevitably leads us down a path of unproductive kind of debating over who is properly scientific versus who isn't.
We wanted to make it about the contributions.
It's the contributions. It's which pipeline, is this project getting dropped into? Is it utopian? Is it scientific? And
which needle is it moving?
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And you can do both. In fact, I think in most cases, the people we've talked about in the paper, the kinds of enactivists that come up a lot, these contributors have done both kinds of work.
And then just on a couple more things, like I think, the contributions were so varied, and I think showed how much people want to be having this conversation about what it is that we're, that we can do with enactivism and where to go from here and what's important and what people want to pursue. And I don't really think that, there's an opportunity to kind of have that conversation, which is what we wanted to open up. So that was just really exciting to see where people want to take enactivism next. There was discussion about integrating with feminist philosophy of science more, which is something I've been working on for a long time. And, there was stuff about, kind of really digging into the ontology of the enactivist philosophy of nature. So that was also really cool, was thinking, oh yes, once we accept that we're building a philosophy of nature, that's exciting. Let's do more ontological work. So that was really cool. And
I mean, Conrad's contribution was fascinating.
Fabulous.
We had we got to see people using our distinction, like Mario Villalobos was sort of using this to explain why there's been problems in neurophenomenology, right? Is people are trying to do these two projects, trying to do utopian and scientific enactivism at the same time.
Running into each other. And
the really interesting thing also came a little bit afterwards. We started to sort of put it out there on social media, and there was a really big response to the paper and a lot of interest. And I think we finish up the end of our kind of response to the commentators, talking about like the end of enactivism as an ism, that we can take these principles of enaction, and that was actually the editor, Alexander Riegler, kind of contributed that way of talking about it. He said, oh, why not talk about inaction? So he never takes credit, I think, for these sorts of ideas in papers, but he should get credit. And I think that it was sort of fascinating how responsive people were to that idea, that I sort of pitched it as controversially as possible by just saying the end of enactivism and then letting people kind of read into that a little bit more. And there are a lot of people primarily within enactivism who are like, yeah, it doesn't have to be an ism. It doesn't have to be this big thing. Let's have that conversation. It was surprising, sort of like the floodgates had been opened to the acceptability of an idea that up until this point, I think had been kind of unthinkable within enactivism. Like certainly from outside, people had had this thought before, but from within enactivism, contemplating the idea of giving up on a monolithic kind of revolutionary change.
It's
I
again,
think
you know,
was a new
yeah, it's a lot of philosophers, and that's how philosophers argue. You know, it's always big, huge change stuff, and it's, you know, the idea that no, we can kind of scale back and, you know, like propose these more kind of incremental, integrative things. It's a shift in how things are just done. You know, and that's really important.
And there are people who are keen to do that. I think that's really interesting. That's who we want to keep connecting with. And I think want to show the virtues of that kind of methodology, if we can call it that, to other people in this field. And I think what it's maybe the positive take home was that while enactivism has had some issues in integration and in application, and there are risks of like a kind of becoming an echo chamber that's cut off from the rest of philosophy and the rest of and from science, is that there are a ton of people who want to do nothing more than to look at alternatives and to see what use enactivism can be, or what use it can be to science.
And are willing to make concessions to do so.
Yeah,
that's just how it's going to have to be.
Yeah. So we're optimistic in that, you know, all the pieces are there. I think there's the people are there, the ideas are there, and it's just going to require a little bit of change in kind of the instinctive responses to problems in philosophy, to veer away from the maybe staking out sort of the combative claim to admonishing, the finger wagging, and doing what maybe comes a little more naturally, which is just to talk. And see what we can figure out. We are philosophers after all, so talking is what we do.
Yeah, I think one of the many merits of your work is that it's timely, but it's also appropriate in the way, in the language that you chose and the distinction that you introduced. And I think it's a really good sign that, as you said, it seemed to open the floodgates. People get excited about it as if they were waiting for this new language to move forward. And I'm looking forward to see what happens next, the responses, you know, the follow-ups, and by you and by other people.
But yeah, we're going to keep trying to work on this. Maybe not this project, but I think we're going to be trying to make our own contributions to more in the direction of, you know, integrating enactivism with other interesting approaches. We both are really interested in like kind of minimal cognition, like basal cognition approach, all these new kinds of stories that are using bits of enactivism, like principles of inaction, are kind of making new moves in biology and cognitive science that are very like pluralistic, very kind of ecumenical. We're really interested in that. And so I think, you know, we might have more to say to enactivism directly. I kind of feel like maybe not. We'll see how that goes. But we certainly are going to be talking more in the space that I think people are going to be interested in. If they're interested in this paper and they think it has something to say, I think our future work will be a little different, but maybe exciting.
Great. Well, Russell, Nick, thank you so much. Let me stop. Thank you. Let me stop the recording, and then we can have our informal goodbye.